What's going on, ladies, gents, and kids of all ages? It is Eric coming back at you once again from the Nerd Cave, and Set 7 is upon us. We are playing with Set 7 cards, and we are building Set 7 decks, and today I want to talk about my update of Amethyst Steel. I think this one is extra spicy and can potentially answer the meta that's happening right now. Before we jump into that, as always, a big shout out to the Patrons for making the giveaways on the channel possible. We're going to have some special Patreon exclusive perks coming up very soon related to a big announcement that we just made. We'll be talking about that more on the channel soon, but if you want to hear about that big announcement, go over and join the Patreon for $1. Check it out. We super appreciate it, and it's going to help fund us giving more things back to you, so if you want to check that out, please do. Without any further ado, let's go ahead and talk about the update to Amethyst Steel aggro going into Set 7. So the first card in the 1-drop spot, we are on 3 Chernobog Followers, Creatures of Evil, a 1-cost inkable 2/1 stat line questing for 1. With whenever this character quests, you may banish them to draw a card. Great way to put on some early game pressure and get some early game card draw. It can also deal with any of those 2 stat line characters, or if a SME challenges into it, they don't have a captain, it's going to take out a SME, or challenging into a SME. So Chernobog can be great for keeping the field clear and also for getting some early game card draw. One of the new additions to this deck in Set 7, it's not a Set 7 card, but it is a card that I think has become relevant in the Set 7 meta more than ever, and that is Mickey Mouse Food Fight Defender. I think people were sleeping on this card during Set 6, and now with Set 7 looking like it's shaping up to be a pretty steel heavy meta, Mickey Mouse Food Fight Defender has become very good with his resist +1. He's only questing for 1, but the 1/2 stat line with resist +1 has made him much better than some of your other 1-drops. Next up, still an absolute staple in Amethyst as far as I'm concerned, we have 4 Diablo Obedient Raven, a 1-cost inkable 0/1 questing for 1. When it's banished, you draw a card. Doesn't get much better than that. It's guaranteeing you it's going to replace itself, and it's going to potentially net you some lore in that early game. It's not going to deal any damage to anything, but it is going to get you some card draw, which is incredibly important. I would put this card up there with Mim Fox in terms of it should probably just be in pretty much every Amethyst list. Spoiler alerts for later in the list. Next up, a card that did carry over that I still think is really good, even with some resist characters running around and that kind of stuff, is Fire the Cannons, deal 2 damage to chosen character. This is a great way to clean up a Bell. This is a great way to straight up banish an Oswald in the early game, which is really going to cripple Sapphire Steel pretty significantly. So I think Fire the Cannons is really good against that deck in particular, and it's good into some other decks. If they go that turn 1 Cinderella, you can go, oh, you wanted to sing your song to banish my character, I'm just going to go ahead and Fire the Cannons your Cinderella and get her right off the board, and they go, oh no, my Cinderella. Also great into Curse Merfolk and some of those aggro deck cards. Next up, jumping over to the 2-cost slot, we are on 3 Madam Mim Snake, a 2-cost inkable 3/3 stat line questing for 1. Fantastic stat line for 2. When you play her, you get to bounce another character back to your hand, and I say get to because they thought it was going to be a drawback ability. We all know that's not the case. It is very much a benefit to this card to be able to bounce another character back to your hand and potentially get comes into play triggers more than once. Speaking of getting comes into play triggers more than once, we are on 3 Doc Bold Knight, a 2-cost uninkable 1/3 stat line questing for 1, and when you play this character, you may discard your hand to draw 2 cards. This is a card that we weren't playing during the Set 6 meta. We were playing Friends on the Other Side instead. I feel like the meta as a whole was a little bit slower than it's potentially going to be in Set 7, and some of the characters that were getting played were cleaning up Doc pretty heartily, not to mention the potential risk that you were going to end up with more than 1 Doc in your hand. We do have ways to resolve that now, and also Doc is much better than Friends when it comes to the bounce package, because you can potentially take advantage of those enter play triggers more than once when you're out of cards in your hand. You draw into like a Mim Snake with a Doc in your hand, you go Mim Snake, Doc, draw 2 more cards, which you can't do with Friends on the Other Side. Speaking of 3/3s for 2, also in the 2-cost slot, we have 4 Mr. Smee Bumbling Mate, a 2-cost inkable 3/3 stat line questing for 2 this time, which is bonkers bananas. And at the end of your turn, if this character is exerted, you don't have a captain character in play, it's going to deal 1 damage to itself. We don't play captain characters in this deck, but you know, we could potentially move that damage off of him, or just get a couple quests in, let him take a challenge, and get off the board. This is more of a count change going from Set 6 to Set 7, but we went from 3 Calhouns to 4 Calhouns, with it shaping up to look like a pretty steel heavy meta. Calhoun is going to be even better than ever. Calhoun is very good against steel with her resist +1, and she has a 2-cost uninkable 3/2 stat line. It's a very good stat line questing for 1, and during your turn, whenever this character banishes another character in a challenge, you are going to get to gain 2 lore. So she is a great way to keep that pressure on, keep up with lore gain. If you're going into one of those aggro decks that are like Daisy Dog quest for 2, instead of playing something that you're going to be able to quest for 1, you get Calhoun down, you start banishing threats, and not only are you cleaning up the board, but you're keeping up with their lore gain potentially. Jumping over to our first new card from from set 7, and that is going to be Giant Cobra, a 3-cost inkable 4/4 stat line, questing for 1. That's right, a 3-cost 4/4, very good. It does have Vanish, so if your opponent is able to target it with an action, it is just going to get straight up banished and it'll be gone. But Giant Cobra's most important skill is when it comes into play, more so as opposed to when it's sitting in play. Being a 4/4 stat line is great, being able to put the pressure on with that is great. If they don't have the direct removal, that's going to be super good on a 3-drop. But if they have the direct removal, really what you're more concerned about is its Mysterious Advantage ability. When you play this character, you may choose and discard a card to gain 2 lore. And that brings us back to kind of what I was talking about with Dock. We do have a way to get rid of an excess Dock now. So say you had 2 Docks in your hand and you didn't want to play one with no trigger, you could potentially play a Giant Snake, discard 1 Dock, and then play the other Dock, trigger, discarding nothing, and then go ahead and draw 2 cards. Speaking of 4/4s for 3, this is a card I've seen people move away from given the steel meta, but I do still think you could definitely take advantage of this card, and that is Lawrence Jealous Manservant, a 3-cost inkable 0/4 stat line. But while this character has no damage, he gets +4, hence my saying he is a 4/4 stat line, questing for 2. So kind of different than Giant Cobra. Once he takes damage, he becomes a 0/4. Giant Cobra, once they're targeted by a spell, they're banished. So they both have potential drawbacks, but Lawrence, again, if they put the damage on him, you can potentially surprise them with getting that damage off of him and then challenging in with a 4/4 character they're not expecting. Another new addition from set 7, we are on 4 Jafar, Aspiring Ruler, a 3-cost inkable 3/2 stat line, questing for 2. And when you play this character, chosen character gains Challenger +2, which is really super good to be able to get some cheeky little challenges in with characters that your opponent's not necessarily scared of. All of a sudden that Chernobog's Followers becomes a 4, and even that Diablo becomes a 2 and can potentially banish something your opponent may not be expecting it to. It is worth noting Jafar is not giving Challenger +3 on the way in and the way out like Crab, so some people have definitely opted to still stay on Crab, and I think that is a worthwhile strategy. I have found with this deck in particular, more so than with Ruby Amethyst, it's really hard to take advantage of that Leaves play trigger for the Crab, so you're more concerned about the Enters play trigger, which Jafar is still doing, and it's giving you +2 instead of +3. The difference here is Jafar is questing for 2, so you can potentially go Jafar on 3, give something plus, take a challenge. If your Jafar isn't removed, next turn you're questing for 2, and then playing something like Fox or Snake, bouncing the Jafar back to your hand, keeping him protected from being banished, and then going into the following turn you're ready to play a Jafar again and give Challenger +2 an additional time. Speaking of foxes, we are on 4 Madam Mim Fox, a 3-cost inkable 4/3 stat line, questing for 1, and when you play this character, banish her or return another chosen character of yours to their hand. And she does have Rush. She's fantastic in everything in the early game. The fact that this card costs 3 is still bananas. Easily one of the best cards in Lorcana, even in 7 sets later. This came out in set 2. Still one of the best cards in the game as far as I'm concerned. Next up, we have 2 Pete Games Referee, a 3-cost inkable 3/3 stat line, questing for 1. With the ability, when you play this character, your opponent cannot play actions until the start of your next turn, so technically until their following turn after that, since there's no instant speed actions in this game. You do see some decks on 3 or 4 Pete's. I don't think that's as necessary when you're looking at Amethyst Steel, again, because you have that bounce package, you have those snakes, you have those foxes, so you can potentially get a Pete down, next turn snake him back to your hand or fox him back to your hand, and then you're ready to play him again and continue shutting off your opponent's actions multiple times potentially. Jumping over to the 4-cost slot, a card I've been on 3 of in this deck. I think this is maybe a 4 of in Ruby Amethyst, but I think it is a decent 3 of in Steel Amethyst, and that is Merlin Goat, a 4-cost inkable 4/3 stat line, questing for 1. When you play this character and when he leaves play, you're going to gain 1 lore, so he's definitely also trying to come down and gain you 2 lore without any discard, just like Giant Cobra. But now having potentially 7 options to close out a game is really good, and they all have that 2 lore jump. So I think Giant Cobra, even though it has the drawback of making you discard to take advantage of its ability, is definitely a more relevant choice than playing something like the White Rose. Next up, also in the 4-cost slot, a card we've seen people move away from somewhat, but I still think is really good. It's not necessarily good against Ruby, but if you're going against those steel decks that I think are really going to be pertinent in the meta, Genie can be really good. He is a 4-cost uninkable 2/4 stat line, so the 4 stat line can keep him outside of the range of strength of a Raging Fire in some instances, and it is going to keep him outside of the range, obviously, of things like Let the Storm Rage on. He is questing for 2, which is fantastic. He is evasive, which makes him difficult for certain color combinations to deal with, and when you play this character, you are going to go ahead and draw a card. So kind of like Merlin Rabbit, but he is only letting you draw 1 on the way in and not on the way out, but he's questing for 2 and he's evasive, and he has a better stat line than Rabbit, so Genie, some give and take there. Obviously, him being uninkable can feel bad in the Ruby matchup. You don't necessarily want to see him there because your opponent is probably going to brawl him. So the best option against Ruby is to draw the brawls out of their hand and then get your Genie down on the board. Sometimes, like when my opponent's been sitting on one for a while and then they ink a brawl, that's when I put my Genie down. Next up, also in the 4-cost slot, we are on 4 Pluto Guard Dog, a 4-cost inkable 1/5 stat line with Bodyguard. While this character has no damage, he is going to get +4, so he becomes a 5/5 stat line. Again, Steel can potentially ping this, drop him down to a 1/5, go ahead and banish him, which isn't always going to feel the best. But that being said, again, we have a way to potentially remove damage from him if he doesn't get banished in real time. Last card in the 4-cost slot, we do have 2 and then Along Came Zeus. This is down from 3 from last set. I still think Along Came Zeus is really good. We may potentially end up going back to 3 depending on how the meta shakes out, but right now I felt a little more comfortable with 2 and letting my characters kind of speak for themselves. It is going to be a 4-cost uninkable action song, and you may deal 5 damage to chosen character or location, and you can sing it with any of those 4-cost characters, of which we have several. And last up in the 5-cost slot, and our way to move some of the damage off of those characters when it is relevant, we do have 3 Bell Accomplished Mystic, a 5-cost inkable 4/4 stat line, questing for 2, shifting for 3, not relevant to this deck because we aren't playing a shift target for her. And when you play this character, you can move up to 3 damage counters from chosen character to chosen opposing character. Worth noting that does get around resist, so it is still going to banish those resist characters as long as they can be targeted. And we are only on 3 of these because they can be potentially situational. They can also be taken advantage of, again, with that bounce combo, so you may only need 1 in some instances. You get it down, you move some damage, you quest in with it next turn, or you take a challenge with it, and then you bounce it back into your hand and then throw it back down, move more damage. So Bell, Accomplished Mystic, still a card that I think is really good in the meta, especially since I think with the rise of the steel decks, even though the steel decks we're seeing aren't necessarily as focused in some instances on the resist characters are going to be super relevant because as the steel meta shakes out, resist characters are going to be a major part of that. So Bell Accomplished Mystic, getting around that, moving damage, getting around that is going to be really good. I will potentially have another deck list coming. We're going to talk about the new Mother Gothel and some combinations with her that I think can be really funny. I think people are really sleeping on a 2-drop in Ruby now that combines really well with Mother Gothel, but we'll talk about that deck more in the future. What did you think about Amethyst Steel? Do you think there's other cards that I overlooked that should be included in it, or cards that aren't? Do you think there's cards that I overlooked that should be included in it, or cards that are in it now that you think I should play something else instead? Always curious to hear y'all's thoughts in the comments below. Remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already. And when you see those toys, video games, and those new set 7 cards like this awesome Jafar off in the distance, remember, it is not a mirage. You guys have a great day.